He had survived assassins, federal investigations, and a dozen betrayals sharp enough to draw blood. But nothing in 20 years of running the most feared criminal organization on the eastern seaboard had prepared Damian Moretti for the sight of his own wedding ring resting on silk sheets beside a sleeping stranger, and the folded letter beneath it written in his wife's handwriting. The woman who never raised her voice. The woman who never begged. The woman who had simply decided sometime in the dark hours before dawn that she was done. The alarm didn't wake him. Nothing woke Damian Moretti gently. Not anymore. What pulled him out of sleep that morning was the quality of the silence. It had weight to it, texture. The kind of silence that fills a room after something has already happened, and the room itself is waiting to tell you. He was 43 years old, and he had learned to read silence the way other men read financial statements. This particular silence told him something was wrong before his eyes had fully opened. Before the gray coastal light filtering through the penthouse curtains had resolved itself into shapes he could name. He was in the Meridian 42nd floor. He kept the suite year-round, under a subsidiary name that didn't connect back to him on paper. Most of his lieutenants didn't know it existed. His lawyers didn't know it existed. It was the one place in the city where Damian Moretti was allowed by his own decree to be something other than what the street had made him. He sat up slowly. The woman beside him was still sleeping. Her dark hair spread against the pillow, one bare shoulder rising and falling in the slow rhythm of someone completely at peace. Her name was Sasha Vane. She was 31 years old, worked in acquisitions at a real estate firm downtown, and had walked into the bar at the Crown Meridian 4 months ago wearing a charcoal wrap dress and an expression that suggested she had no idea who he was. That had been the thing that hooked him. The not knowing, the clean slate of it. He had told himself it wasn't serious. He had told himself a lot of things. He reached for his phone on the nightstand and stopped. The ring was sitting on the sheet beside him. Gold band, slightly worn on the inner edge from 20 years of being worn and removed and worn again. He recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Not by looking closely, but by some interior knowing that doesn't require examination. It was his wedding ring. He always removed it when he came here. He always put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, which he always draped over the chair beside the window. He looked at the chair. His jacket was there. He looked at the ring on the sheet. Beneath the ring, folded once, was a piece of hotel stationery. The Meridian's cream-colored paper with the gold letterhead, and written on it in a hand he would have known in complete darkness, was a single page of words that changed everything. He picked it up. His hands were steady. Damian Moretti's hands were always steady. That was something people commented on. How still he kept himself, even when the situation called for something else. It had taken him a long time to understand that the stillness wasn't control. It was a kind of numbness that had calcified over years, until it passed for discipline. He read the letter. Damian, I didn't come here to confront you. I came here because I needed to see it for myself. And now I have. I thought maybe seeing it would make me angrier than I already was. It didn't. It just made me tired. I am 4 months along. I found out 6 weeks ago. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you. And then I stopped trying to figure that out and started trying to figure out something harder. What kind of world I am willing to bring a child into? The answer isn't this one. It isn't a world where the man who is supposed to be a father is in a hotel room 40 floors above the street with someone he met in a bar, while I am sitting in a house that has guards at the gate and cameras on every corner, and still somehow feels completely empty. I am not writing this to punish you. I am writing it because you deserve to know the truth before I disappear, and because I want at least one honest moment between us before I go. You can't find me if I don't want to be found. You know that better than anyone. Don't spend your resources looking. Use them to keep what you built, because that is the only thing you have ever really loved. Elena. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original crease and set it on the nightstand with the same careful precision he brought to everything. Contracts, negotiations, verdicts. He sat on the edge of the bed in the pre-dawn gray, and he didn't move for almost 4 minutes. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. It was just past 5 in the morning. The harbor was dark silver. The towers along the financial district were beginning to come on floor by floor, the office lights punching through the haze. Down on the street, he could see the first delivery trucks, the Urla joggers, the particular aloneness of a city at that hour. When the people who stayed up late have finally gone home, and the people who rise early haven't yet reached full density, it looked like every other morning he had watched from this window. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He picked up his phone and called his head of security. Marcus Webb picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which meant something had already happened that Damian didn't know about yet. "She was here," Damian said. A pause. "We are aware," Marcus said. "How long have you been aware?" Another pause, and shorter this time. Webb knew better than to drag it out. "She came through the lobby around midnight, used a guest key. We didn't flag it in real time because you didn't know she knew about this suite." "No, sir. Nobody knew." "Apparently not." Webb's voice was flat in the way that professional men go flat when they are choosing their words, like a man picking his way through a minefield. "She had the key, Damian. A physical key, old format, not digital. It came from somewhere." Damian turned from the window. On the bed, Sasha Vane was still sleeping. He watched her for a moment, her chest rising and falling. The small scar on her collarbone he had never asked about. The particular way her fingers curled against the sheet. "Get a team to the house," he said. "Full sweep. I want to know when she left, how she left, and where the vehicles went. Already running. She cleared out sometime yesterday afternoon, left the security detail. We found Carver and Soto zip-tied in the garage." Damian closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Alive?" he asked. Embarrassed, but alive. "She apparently made them coffee first. That was Elena." He almost said it out loud. "The other one," he said. "The woman in this room. I want a full background pulled. Real background, not the surface layer. Employment records, financial movement, prior addresses, family connections, everything." "Yes, Damian. Is there something specific I should be looking for?" "I don't know yet. That is why I want the background." He ended the call and stood in the silence of the suite. He let himself feel for exactly 1 more minute the thing he hadn't felt since he was a young man sitting in a hospital waiting room while his mother died of something slow and preventable that money would have fixed if they had had it sooner. He let himself feel it, and then he put it somewhere it couldn't interfere with what needed to happen next. He got dressed. He left the suite. He didn't wake Sasha. The Moretti organization had existed in various forms for almost 30 years. Damian's father had built the foundation. Import operations, union management, a network of legitimate businesses that generated clean revenue, while the real money moved through channels invisible to the average forensic accountant. When Damian took over at 31 following his father's stroke, the organization had been profitable but structurally fragile. He had spent a decade reinforcing it. He had made alliances, broken alliances, absorbed 2 smaller operations, and negotiated the kind of territorial boundaries that kept the city's power structure in an uncomfortable but functional equilibrium. He had also gotten married. Elena Ashford had come from money. Old money. The kind that arrives in a city several generations before anyone starts writing its history. Her father had been a maritime attorney whose firm had done legitimate business with Damian's holding companies for years before Elena and Damian met at a charity event neither of them had wanted to attend. He had expected nothing from the evening. She had laughed at something, he said. Really laughed. Not the performed laughter of a woman trying to make a powerful man comfortable. And he had been completely undone by it. He had courted her for 8 months. Her father had done his research and said nothing about what he found, which Damian had always respected. The wedding had been small by the standards of what his position could have produced. 70 guests at a coastal estate late October. The ceremony conducted by a retired judge who owed Damian a favor and kept it to himself. Elena had worn something simple in ivory, and she had looked at him during the vows with an expression he still couldn't fully name. Not love exactly, or not only love. Something more like a deliberate choice, a decision made in full awareness of what it cost. She had never pretended not to know what he was. That was the thing that had always separated her from the women who came before. The ones who told themselves stories about import businesses and consulting fees and didn't ask questions. Elena had known. She had chosen anyway, and she had maintained for nearly 12 years a dignity in that choice that he had never fully deserved. He had told himself the other thing. Sasha, the hotel, the 4 months of whatever it was a consequence of pressure. The federal task force that had been circling his financial operations since the previous spring. The loss of the Harkin contract, which had destabilized 2 years of careful positioning in the Port Authority. The death of his oldest lieutenant, a man named Carver Sr., who had been with his father since the beginning, and whose passing had left a gap in the organization's institutional memory that nobody could quite fill. He had told himself he was under pressure, and that what happened was understandable. He understood now that this was a thing men told themselves to avoid looking directly at the simpler truth, that he had been careless with the one person who had asked nothing from him except honesty, and that carelessness had a cost. By 6 in the morning, he was in the operations center on the 4th floor of a building in the warehouse district that appeared on city records as a logistics company. Marcus Webb was there with 2 analysts and a wall of screens showing traffic feeds, cell tower data, and the live maps from his ground teams. She used a rideshare, Webb said. Booked under a name we don't recognize. Paid cash through a third-party app. We tracked the pickup point 2 blocks from the Meridian corner of State and Harrow at 4:17 a.m. The vehicle dropped her at Union Station. Train eastbound, 5:10 departure. We are pulling the manifest, but she wouldn't have used her real name, and she had cash. Webb paused. Damian, she planned this. She didn't just decide last night and run. The cash, the key, the cover name. She has been thinking about this for a while. Damian said nothing. The zip ties on Carver and Soto, Marcus continued. She used the restraints from the emergency kit in the garage. She knew exactly where it was, and she did it cleanly. Both of them said she didn't seem scared or upset. She was calm. She apologized for the inconvenience. Damian looked at the map on the wall. Expand the eastern corridor. Flag every station within a 4-hour range. I want eyes on all of them. She could have gotten off anywhere. Change trains at the first stop. I know. Expand it anyway. One of the analysts turned from his screen. Young man, maybe 25, whose name Damian could never remember, even though he had been working here for 2 years. Mr. Moretti, there is something else. Damian looked at him. The background you ordered on Sasha Vane. We started pulling, and the analyst glanced at Webb, who gave him a small nod. There are some irregularities, financial irregularities. She has a brokerage account at Harmon Rice that was opened 14 months ago with a $50,000 deposit. The deposit originated from a shell company in the Caymans. The shell company traces, and this takes 4 layers to get to. So I want to be clear, this is preliminary. The shell company traces back to entities associated with the Callaway Group. The room went quiet. Damian stood very still. Say that again. The Callaway Group, sir, or something structured to look like them. We would need more time to be certain. The Callaway Group. Emmett Callaway ran the syndicate out of the northern cities, a rival organization that had been in Cold War with the Moretti operation for the better part of a decade. They had nearly gone to open conflict twice in the past 3 years. Both times it had been walked back through intermediaries and economic negotiation because open conflict between organizations of their size was ruinous for everyone. Emmett Callaway, whatever else he was not a stupid man. Or so Damian had believed. When was the brokerage account opened? Damian asked. He said 14 months ago. Damian did the math. Sasha Vane had walked into the Crown Meridian bar 4 months ago. The account had been opened 10 months before that. Someone had taken a year to set this up. How did she know about the suite? He asked. And the question wasn't directed at anyone in the room. He was asking the room itself, the screen, the data. That suite is registered to a holding company that doesn't connect to me on any document that exists. My own people don't know about it, Webb said carefully. Someone in your own people does. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence in the hotel room. That silence had been grief. This one was something colder. Get Ricci on the phone, Damian said. I want him here in 20 minutes. Vincent Ricci was Damian's consigliere. 48 years old, 22 years in the organization. The man who had stood beside Damian at his father's funeral and helped him navigate the transition. The man who knew more about the structure of the Moretti operation than anyone alive except Damian himself. The man who by necessity would know about any holding company registered under any name that Damian had ever used. Webb was watching him with an expression that was careful and controlled, but not quite controlled enough. "Do you want me to brief him?" Marcus asked. "No," Damian said. "Don't tell him anything. Just get him here." While they waited for Ricci, Damian sat in the small office at the back of the operations center and read Elena's letter again. He had transferred it from the hotel to his jacket pocket, and the paper had already taken on the particular soft quality of something handled in the dark. She was 4 months pregnant. He counted backward. 4 months put conception in late summer, which meant she had known for 6 weeks. Which meant she had been carrying this knowledge through the autumn, through the weeks of tension and distance that had settled between them. The evenings when she moved through the house, with the particular careful politeness of a woman who has decided to protect someone from something by not naming it. He had read that politeness as her version of patience. He understood now it was something else entirely. It was the grace period she had given him to come forward on his own. He hadn't known there was a clock running. He hadn't known because he had been telling himself stories about pressure and circumstance while his wife sat in a house with guards at the gate and cameras on every corner, and planned her exit with the methodical precision of someone who had learned from years of watching him exactly how a disciplined person disappears. She was pregnant. She was alone somewhere in the eastern corridor. She had been the target of his enemies before he understood she was a target, and she had no idea. He put the letter away. He stood up. He walked back to the main floor where Webb was on a call. One of the analysts was running data, and the screen showed a city going about its morning in complete ignorance of everything happening in this room. When Ricci gets here, Damian said to Webb, who covered the phone and looked at him, put him in the conference room. "Don't tell him I am already here." Webb nodded, and Marcus. He waited until he had the man's full attention. "The people who put Sasha Vane in my path. If this is what the data suggests, they didn't do it to take me down operationally. They did it to isolate me, to separate me from her." He stopped. "They needed Elena away from my protection before they moved on the organization, and I gave them exactly what they needed." Webb said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "Find my wife," Damian said. "That is the priority. Everything else is secondary. Find her before they do." Vincent Ricci arrived at 6:40 in a black car, wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of a man summoned early who was working very hard to appear unconcerned. He was a compact man, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that gave nothing away, even when his hands occasionally did. A small tightening of the fingers. A particular stillness in the left hand that Damian had learned over 22 years to read like a tell. Damian watched him through the one-way glass as Ricci settled into the conference room and checked his phone twice and then set the phone face down on the table, which was something Ricci never did. Vincent Ricci kept his phone face up in every meeting Damian had ever watched him in. Face up meant he was managing information. Face down meant he didn't want to see it come in. Damian went into the conference room and sat across from him. "Early morning," Ricci said. "Webb didn't tell me what this was about." "Elena left," Damian said. "Last night. She is gone." Ricci's expression moved through something that lasted less than a second. Not surprise exactly. More like the rapid internal adjustment of a man recalibrating. "Gone how?" Ricci asked. "Gone without a trace. Her own security incapacitated." He watched Ricci's face. "You knew about the Meridian suite." "Of course, I set up the holding company for you, Damian, 3 years ago. Who else knew?" Ricci spread his hands. "Nobody. The documents are clean. The paper trail is clean. She was there, Vincent. Elena was in that suite last night. She walked in using a physical key. A physical key that came from somewhere." He kept his voice level. "Sasha Vane. Tell me what you know about her." The left hand. There it was. The fingers pressed flat against the table for just a moment before Ricci let them relax. "I don't know anything about her. Should I? Financial connections to the Calloway Group," Damian said. Ricci was very still. That is a serious accusation to put in a room. It is a preliminary data point that I am asking you to help me understand, because the sweet key and the Callaway connection, and the fact that Elena is now missing and pregnant, those things form a shape, Vincent. And the shape they form requires someone on the inside of my organization to complete it. The silence stretched. Ricci looked at him across the table with 22 years of shared history between them. And Damian sat inside that silence and read every micro-movement and let nothing show on his own face and waited. "I need to make a call," Ricci said finally. "No," Damian said. "You don't." Another silence. "You should be careful," Ricci said quietly, "about what conclusions you are drawing." "I am not drawing conclusions. I am collecting information." He stood. "You are going to stay in this building today. You are not going to make calls. Webb is going to make sure you are comfortable." Ricci looked up at him. The careful composure was there, professionally intact, but something behind it had shifted. Some quiet pressure that Damian recognized as the particular anxiety of a man who has something to protect and is trying to figure out how much time he has left. "Damian," Ricci said, "you need to be very careful about what you do next." "I know exactly what I am doing next," Damian said. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "I am finding my wife." By 7:30, the first rival signal arrived. It came in the form of a call from a man named Benedetti, who ran the Southern Docks operation under a loose affiliation agreement with the Moretti organization. The kind of arrangement that functioned as long as Moretti's strength was unquestioned, and became elastic the moment any question appeared. Benedetti called Damian's direct line and said in the careful language of men who never say what they mean directly, that there were some questions circulating about the Moretti organization's current operational capacity, and that he wanted to have a conversation before making any decisions that might affect their arrangement. It was 7:30 in the morning. News traveled fast when people were waiting for it to travel. "Tell Benedetti I will call him back," Damian said to the assistant who had transferred the call this afternoon. He wouldn't call him back this afternoon. What he was doing this afternoon would not include calls to nervous affiliates. But the call itself told him what he needed to know. Someone had already begun to signal the network that the Moretti operation was in distress. That kind of signal didn't spread organically. It was seeded. He thought about Ricci sitting in the conference room. He thought about the left hand pressed flat on the table. He thought about 22 years of proximate loyalty and the particular patience it would take to construct something like this. Not days or weeks, but months of careful positioning, of planting a woman in the right place, of feeding information about a hotel suite key to someone who would use it, of arranging the conditions under which Damian Moretti would be isolated from his wife, from his judgment, from the clarity that comes from having someone in your life who tells you the truth. He thought about Elena writing a letter in a hotel room in the dark hours of the morning, while her husband slept 8 floors above her, beside a woman who had been put in his path by his enemies. She had come to see for herself, she had seen. And then she had vanished in a way that only a highly intelligent woman who had spent 12 years watching how a criminal organization operates could manage to vanish. The problem was that Elena had vanished from him, but she had not vanished from the people who had been watching her for months. The people who knew about the pregnancy, the people who understood that a legal heir to the Moretti fortune was not a private family matter, but a structural threat to anyone who wanted to take control of what Damian had built. His phone rang. It was one of the analysts in the operations center. "Mr. Moretti, we have got a hit on the train manifest. Passenger boarding at Union Station at 5:10 a.m. eastbound under the name Claire Hartwell. Female, mid-30s, paid cash for a first-class compartment." "Where does it stop?" Damian asked. "First major stop is Whitmore Junction, 140 miles east. Scheduled arrival 7:52. He looked at his watch. It was 7:38. "Who do we have in Whitmore?" "Nobody currently active, but Damian," the analyst hesitated. "There is a vehicle on the highway running parallel to the rail line. A black SUV registered to a shell company out of Delaware. It has been tracking the train speed and heading since approximately 6 a.m. The cold thing that lived inside Damian Moretti's chest, The thing he had built over years as a necessary internal architecture did not move, but something adjacent to it did. Something that was not quite fear, but occupied the same territory. Who owns the Delaware shell? Working on it. But the company was formed 11 months ago. Same window as the Vane brokerage account. 11 months ago. Someone had started this a year before Elena walked into that hotel suite. Before Damian had ever seen Sasha Vane. Before the affair. Before the distance. Before the letter on the cream-colored paper that was folded in his jacket pocket right now. They had planned for the outcome before the outcome existed. They had built the infrastructure to move on Elena before they had created the conditions that would cause her to run, which meant they understood Damian better than he understood himself. They had known that if they put the right woman in his path at the right moment of pressure and vulnerability, he would make the choice he made. They had known it with enough certainty to park vehicles on highways months before it happened. He walked back into the main operations floor. Webb looked up from a screen. "Tell me you have someone who can get to Whitmore Junction in the next 14 minutes, Damian said. Webb's face did something complicated. State police have jurisdiction. If we put armed personnel on a moving train. I am not sending armed personnel to a train station, Marcus. I am sending one person to find my wife and tell her she is in immediate danger from people who have had her in their sights for almost a year." He stopped himself, breathed. "Find someone, a woman if possible. Someone Elena doesn't know and won't read as a threat. Fast." Webb was already reaching for his phone. Damian stood in the center of the operations floor, surrounded by screens and data and the low-frequency hum of a machine he had built over a decade. A machine that could track a person across a city, that could reach into a database and pull the bones of someone's financial history, that could read the shape of a conspiracy from fragmented data points and incomplete information. A machine built for exactly this kind of problem. And none of it could undo the fact that he had been sitting in a hotel room 40 floors above the street, while the woman who was carrying his child was moving through the dark hours of the morning with a letter she had written him, and a plan she had made alone, because she had decided somewhere in the long silence of the months past that she couldn't count on him anymore. He had built all of this, and it had cost him the one thing that couldn't be reconstructed through leverage and intelligence and force of will. He was going to get her back. Not because she was an asset, not because the organization required an heir, or because the rival syndicate had made her a target. He was going to get her back because she was Elena, and because the letter she had left him, calm and tired and precise and still even now unwilling to be cruel, was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in longer than he could remember. And because she was out there somewhere on an eastbound train, in a compartment booked under a false name, thinking she was running from him, while someone else entirely was already closing in. The SUV on the highway kept pace with the train, 140 miles of track between Union Station and Whitmore Junction, 14 minutes. Webb said from across the room, "I have got someone. She will make it." Damian didn't respond. He was staring at the map. Somewhere on that map, his wife was sitting in a first-class compartment, watching the countryside go gray with early morning light, and she believed she was free of him. She believed the hardest thing was behind her. She believed the danger was the life she had left, not the thing moving toward her on the highway parallel to the tracks. He needed her to keep believing that, just long enough for his contact to reach her. Just long enough to buy the minutes necessary to change what happened next. The clock on the operations wall read 7:41. 11 minutes, the SUV held its pace. The woman Webb sent was named Diane Chu. She was 38 years old, worked logistics for one of the Moretti organization's legitimate freight companies, and had the particular quality of being entirely forgettable in a crowd. Medium height, dark coat, the kind of face that your eyes slide off of without registering. She had grown up in this city, and she had worked adjacent to dangerous men for long enough to understand the difference between a job that required discretion and a job that required speed. This one required both. She made Whitmore Junction with 4 minutes to spare. Damian listened to the feed through an earpiece Webb had patched to her phone. He stood at the operations center wall and didn't move, and didn't speak, while Diane Chu walked through the small station, with the particular unhurried pace of a woman who was not running towards something. The train pulled in at 7:54, 2 minutes behind schedule. "She is in car 7, Webb said quietly. Compartment C. Damian heard platform noise through the earpiece. The hiss of brakes, doors opening, the disorganized shuffle of passengers who have been sitting for an hour and are suddenly released. Then Diane's voice, low and even. "Elena Ashford." A pause, then a woman's voice that Damian hadn't heard in 3 days, which felt like a longer interval than it was. Careful, controlled. The voice of someone who has already decided not to be surprised by anything. "I don't know you," Elena said. "No, my name is Diane. I work for your husband. Then you need to walk away. There is a black SUV in the parking lot, Delaware plates. It has been tracking this train since before you boarded." Silence on the line. 3 seconds. 4. "How many?" Elena asked. Elena's voice had not changed in register. That was the thing about her. She didn't perform panic. She processed. "We are confirming at least 2 individuals, possibly 3, Diane said. Another silence. "Then he sent you." "Yes, tell him." Elena stopped. Damian could hear her breathing controlled but not slow, the particular rhythm of someone managing adrenaline through force of will. "Tell him I don't need his people. Mrs. Ashford." Diane's voice dropped further. "You are 4 months pregnant, and there are men in this parking lot who know that. That is what I am here to tell you. Whatever else is happening between you and him, that is between you. But those men in the lot are not here because of anything you did. They are here because of what you are carrying. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" The silence this time was different. Damian stood in the operations center and listened to it and felt it in his chest like something physical. "Yes," Elena said finally. "Quiet." A word stripped of everything except the information it carried. "Then we need to move now. There is a service exit at the north end of the platform." Damian heard footsteps, then Elena's voice again, closer to the phone. "Damian." He realized Diane had handed her the phone. "I am here," he said. "I want to be very clear about something." Her voice was steady, in the way that costs something to maintain. "I am not coming back. I am not doing this because I have changed my mind about anything. I am doing this because I am not stupid. I know. Don't do the thing where you agree with everything I say because you need me to cooperate right now. I know how you work, Elena." He stopped, started again. "There is a lot I need to tell you that I can't tell you on this line. But the thing in the parking lot is real. Please go with Diane." A pause. "Then where are you sending me?" "Safe house," Damian said. 40 minutes east of Whitmore. It is clean. It is not in any network anyone connected to this organization knows about. I set it up 2 years ago for a situation I hoped would never happen. You set up a place to hide your wife 2 years ago. I set up a place to protect whoever needed protecting. I didn't know it would be you. I should have." He stopped himself from saying more. There was a time for the rest of it, and this wasn't it. "Will you go?" A long pause, long enough that he thought she might hand the phone back to Diane or simply drop it on the platform. "Yes," she said. "But Damian." Her voice was flat and precise, and he could hear something in it that was not anger exactly. Anger would have been easier. "When this is over, I want the truth. All of it. Not the version you decide I can handle." "You will get it," he said. She ended the call. He stood in the operations center and breathed, and the room around him continued its mechanical activity. Screens updating, analysts cross-referencing, Webb giving instructions to the ground teams, and none of it touched him for the 30 seconds it took to put his face back into its working configuration. Then he said, "The SUV, I want eyes on it." "Already on it," Webb said. 2 men in the lot. Third one was inside the station. "We think he boarded the train at Union Station to confirm her identity and drained here. He is in the parking lot now. Let them sit. I want to know where they go when the train leaves without her on it." The SUV sat in the Whitmore Junction parking lot for 11 minutes after the eastbound train pulled out. Then it moved. It didn't follow the train. It turned west and ran back toward the city at consistent highway speed, not rushing, not dawdling. The behavior of men who had completed a task and were reporting back, which meant they had confirmed Elena's presence on the train and drained after Whitmore. But they hadn't yet realized she hadn't continued east. They thought they had her location. They were going to report it. "Good," Damian said. "Let them report." How long before whoever sent them knows she didn't reboard? Next station east is 60 miles. Train arrival at 9:20. If they have someone waiting, maybe an hour. We have an hour, Damian said. He turned to Webb. Ricci. Webb said nothing. I want to talk to him. Vincent Ricci was sitting in the conference room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and his phone still face down on the table. He looked up when Damian came in, and the careful composure was fully reconstructed. Whatever crack had shown earlier was sealed. He had used the time well. Elena is safe, Damian said. He sat down. In case you were concerned. Of course I am concerned. She is. Don't, Damian interrupted. Damian's voice was quiet. That particular quiet that people who had worked around him for years had learned to treat as a more serious signal than shouting. Don't perform it for me, Vincent. Not today. Ricci set down the coffee cup. His hands were steady. 22 years had given him good hands. I don't know what you think you found. I found a woman with a brokerage account connected to Callaway Money who knew about a suite that only you could have told her about. He kept his eyes on Ricci's face. I found a vehicle tracking my wife on a highway this morning that was registered to a shell company formed 11 months ago. Same window as everything else. He paused. Tell me what I am missing. You are missing the possibility that your data is wrong or that someone else. Who else? Damian asked. Vincent, name someone else who knew about the Meridian. Ricci was quiet. Name them. Damian. Ricci's voice shifted into something lower, older. The voice of a man abandoning a position he can no longer hold. You have to understand, this was not what I built, was not about harming Elena. It was never about her. The room went very still. It was about transition, Ricci said. The organization has been under federal pressure for 18 months. The Harkin situation, the task force. You have been making decisions under stress that I don't believe you would make with clear eyes. The Benedetti arrangement, the expansion into the northern port, You have been compromised. The affair was not something I engineered to hurt you. It was. He stopped. His hands finally were not entirely steady. It was to create a reset, a moment of crisis that would force a restructuring. A restructuring, Damian said, of leadership, of the organization's direction. Ricci's eyes were direct now. The composure traded for something that might, in a different context, have read as sincerity. I have been with this organization since before you ran it, Damian. I built half of what you think you built. And I watched you spend the last 2 years making it smaller and more vulnerable because you were distracted, and you put a woman in my path. You gave her the key to a hotel suite that my wife didn't know about. You arranged for Elena to find out in a way that would drive her out of the house. His voice was still quiet. The quieter it got, the more Ricci's composure deteriorated. And then you put vehicles on the highway to track her because she is carrying the air. Because as long as there is a legal heir, a restructuring of leadership gets complicated. That is not, Ricci's voice cracked slightly. The vehicles were protective. They were there to monitor, not to. Who drives the SUVs, Vincent? Silence. Who is in those cars? Because they are not my people. I have checked every name in our network, and those plates don't connect to anyone I have hired. So, either you contracted independently. Damian stopped. Let the rest of the sentence sit in the room unspoken. Ricci's left hand pressed flat on the table. You brought outside people into this organization, Damian said. Into my organization to track my wife. To protect the. Stop using that word. For the first time, the quiet broke. Not into shouting. Into something more controlled and more dangerous than that. Stop using the word protect for what you did. You built a conspiracy to remove me from my own organization. And you used my marriage as the mechanism. And the woman I have been sleeping with for 4 months has been feeding you information and feeding Callaway's people information. And neither of those things is an accident. Ricci looked at him. The composure was gone entirely now. What was underneath it was not guilt exactly. It was something older and more complicated. The expression of a man who had committed to a course of action long enough ago that he had stopped questioning its justification and was only now being forced to look at it directly. Callaway's involvement was for stability, Ricci said. A managed transition, not a takeover. They would have provided a buffer during. Callaway would have eaten what was left. Damian stood. How many people in this organization are yours? Ricci said nothing. How many people have you turned? Nothing. Vincent. He leaned forward, both hands on the table. I have known you for 22 years. I have trusted you with things I have not trusted anyone else with. And you have spent a year building the architecture of my removal using my wife's pain as the foundation. He straightened. I need numbers. I need names. Because the people you brought in from the outside. I need to know who they are before they figure out that Elena didn't reboard that train. Ricci looked up at him for the first time since he had walked in. He looked his age. Older, maybe. And if I give you names, then we have a conversation about what comes next. And if I don't? Damian didn't answer that. He walked to the door, knocked twice. Webb came in with another man. Ricci looked at them, and then looked back at Damian, and something moved across his face. The particular shift of a man calculating odds and arriving at an unfavorable number. 14, Ricci said quietly, in the organization. People who understood the situation and agreed with the direction. 14. Damian absorbed this. 14 out of how many? 14 who had sat in rooms with him, shared information, executed his instructions, and been feeding data to a parallel structure that was dismantling him from inside and outside the organization. Calloway's people, I don't have exact numbers, 6 or 8. The vehicles were theirs. Where are they operating from while they are in the city? Ricci hesitated. Then, with the resignation of a man crossing a line he knows is the last one he will cross, the portside storage facility on 9th. He has 4 units rented under an import company name. Damian looked at Webb. Webb was already on his phone. One more question, Damian said. He moved back toward the table toward Ricci and stood close enough that there was no distance left to perform across. The baby, Elena being pregnant. Did Calloway know? Ricci's jaw tightened. Yes. Before or after she left? Before, several weeks before. Which meant the plan to track her on that train had been in motion for weeks. Which meant the vehicles on the highway this morning had not been improvised. They had been positioned and waiting for the moment Elena ran. A moment Ricci had helped engineer, so that when she did, they would be ready to follow her to wherever she went, and deal with the complication of a legal heir in whatever way Calloway considered appropriate. Damian stepped back from the table. He looked at the man across from him. This man he had known since he was 31 years old. This man who had sat beside him and advised him and shaped 22 years of decisions. And he felt something that was not rage. Rage was too clean for what this was. What this was had no clean name. Marcus, he said. Yeah, hold him here, comfortable. Not a cell, a room. Food if he wants it. He paused at the door. He is going to cooperate fully for the next 48 hours. If he doesn't, everything he has told us is going straight to the federal task force with his name on the transmitter. Ricci looked up sharply. Damian, you built your transition, Vincent. I am just changing where it leads. He walked out. The next 6 hours were the kind that aged a man. Damian ran 4 simultaneous operations from the back of a moving car, sweeping the 14 internal compromised members from positions of access without triggering a broader organizational panic, coordinating with Webb on the portside facility, maintaining enough normal operational activity that nothing reached Calloway's people before the portside sweep was complete, and tracking Elena's progress to the safe house through Diane Chu's intermittent check-ins. Elena arrived at the safe house at 9:40. She was safe. She was, according to Diane's text, which consisted of exactly 3 words, calm and furious. Damian read those 3 words, and something in him that had been clenched since 5 in the morning released fractionally. Calm he could work with. Furious was appropriate. She was alive and 4 months along, and somewhere clean and untraceable. And the men who had been parked outside Whitmore Junction were currently driving back toward a city where Damian was rapidly eliminating every advantage they thought they had. At 11:15, Webb called. Portside is clear. We have got the 4 units, 6 individuals. Like Ricci said, we are holding them separate and quiet. Calloway. He is in his northern city as far as we can tell. He doesn't know yet that the Whitmore operation didn't complete. He doesn't know we have rolled Ricci. How long before he knows? Hard to say. His people will check in on a schedule. When they miss it, he will assume something went wrong and escalate. Damian looked out the car window at the city, going about its afternoon business. which means we have a window, short one. What do we do with it? He thought about Ricci's face across the conference room table, the careful composure, and then the thing underneath it. The man who had built 22 years of loyalty and then spent a year, methodically, dismantling everything it had meant. He thought about Elena in a safe house 40 minutes east of Whitmore, calm and furious, with their child, and a letter she had written in the dark. He thought about Calloway. "I am going north," he said. Webb was quiet for a moment. He made this personal. "He used my marriage as a piece in something he was moving around aboard. He put vehicles on the highway to track a pregnant woman." His voice was level. "I am going north. Damian, if you walk into Calloway's city without an army, I am not walking in without anything. I am walking in with everything Ricci gave us and everything we pulled from the portside units. I am walking in with the knowledge of every piece of this conspiracy and who built it and how it was funded. And I am going to sit across a table from Emmett Calloway and explain to him very clearly that the managed transition he purchased from my consigliere is not going to happen." He stopped. "And then I am going to make him an offer he doesn't want but will take." "What offer?" "The only one I have." He looked at his hands, steady as always. All of it. Everything Ricci has been feeding him. The structure, the accounts, the operational map of the Northern Port expansion. I am going to hand him everything he wanted from a takeover. And I am going to do it voluntarily in exchange for Elena and the child being completely removed from this. Not threatened, not tracked, not relevant to any future arrangement. Webb said nothing for a long moment. "You are going to give him the organization. I am going to give him the parts of the organization that are already going to be taken apart, the illegitimate parts, the parts that the federal task force has been building a case against for 18 months. He let that sit. He can have them. They are a liability dressed as assets, and any competent analyst looking at them clearly would know it. I am going to let Emmett Calloway believe he is getting the prize, and I am going to hand him the parts that are going to burn, and the rest is above board. Legitimate businesses, clean revenue streams, holdings that will survive a full federal audit. Those don't go to Calloway. Those go to something else." He paused. "But first, I need to reach Calloway before he escalates and does something to Elena that neither of us can walk back from." Webb exhaled. "I will get the car ready." "One more thing." Damian sat forward. "Elena doesn't know where I am going. I don't want her to know until it is done. She is going to be angry. She is already angry. At least this way she will be angry somewhere safe." He ended the call. He sat back in the seat. Outside the city slid past, the warehouses and the service roads of the industrial quarter giving way to the broader avenues. The lunch traffic, the ordinary texture of a Thursday, that knew nothing about what was moving through it. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, but the message told him who had sent it before he had processed the number itself. It was 3 words, like Diane's text. But these 3 words were not describing Elena's state of mind. They were coordinates, and below the coordinates, 4 more words. He already knows. Run. The number was Ricci's private cell. He had sent it from the room where Webb had left him, which meant he had had a second phone on him that they hadn't found, which meant the controlled situation at the operations center was no longer controlled, which meant Calloway had been notified before Damian had made the call to go north, which meant the window he thought he had was already closed. He stared at the coordinates. He knew the location. A coastal estate 2 hours south of the city. One of 3 properties that Damian's holding companies owned under layers of subsidiary structure that not even Ricci fully knew. Except somebody clearly did. His phone rang. It was Diane Chu. "She is gone," Diane said. Her voice was steady but wrong in a way that told him the steadiness was costing her. "I stepped out for 10 minutes. There was a car, black, no plates. It came up the service road and she went with them. She didn't fight. I think she thought it was one of yours." The world reduced to a very small, very clear point. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, they didn't. They weren't there for me. They took her and they left." He was already moving. "Stay at the location. Don't leave. Don't call anyone except this number." He ended the call and told his driver before the call was fully disconnected. "The coastal estate on Route 9. Move." The driver moved. Damian sat in the back of the car with the coordinates on his phone and Diane's 3 words echoing in the specific frequency of his worst possibilities. And he understood with complete clarity that the window had not just closed. It had been closed before he ever knew it existed. Calloway hadn't sent those vehicles to track Elena. He had sent them to collect her. And Ricci, sitting in a room in the operations center with a second phone in his jacket, had just told him exactly where they had taken her. The coastal estate on Route 9 was 2 hours south on a clear road. Damian's driver made it in 94 minutes. The property sat at the end of a private access road that came off the highway through a grove of maritime pine. The trees old enough and dense enough that you couldn't see the house from the road, even in winter, when the branches were bare. Damian had purchased it through 4 layers of subsidiary structure 7 years ago as a contingency asset. A place that existed in no operational map, no organizational chart, no document that any rival or federal investigator had ever touched. He had told no one about it, not Webb, not Ricci, except Ricci had sent him coordinates that matched it exactly. He thought about that during the 94 minutes. He thought about it with the particular focused attention of a man who has stopped feeling things temporarily, because feeling them would interfere with thinking clearly. Ricci had known about this property, which meant either Damian's subsidiary structure was less airtight than he believed, or Ricci had been inside his financial architecture at a depth that Damian had never authorized and never detected. 22 years. A man could learn a great deal in 22 years if he was patient and careful and kept his face in the right configuration. Webb called twice during the drive. Damian let it go to voicemail both times. He would deal with Webb after. Right now, he needed the drive. Needed the 94 minutes of pine trees and gray highway and the sound of the engine to arrive at the estate in a state that was useful rather than one that would get Elena killed. He told the driver to stop a quarter mile from the access road. He got out alone. He went through the tree line on foot. He had a weapon, a compact 9mm he kept in a locked box beneath the rear seat, which his driver had retrieved without being asked, because the driver had worked for Damian for 6 years and understood the difference between situations. Damian moved through the pines with the careful deliberateness of someone who has not done this specific thing in a long time, but whose body still remembers how. He was not a field operative. He had not been one since his early 30s, but he had started in this business at the ground level, and certain things did not entirely leave you. He came around the north side of the tree line and saw the house. 2 black vehicles in the gravel lot, both with plates. Different plates from the Delaware SUV, which meant either Calloway's people had multiple vehicle pools, or someone was being careful about trace connections, which suggested professionalism, which made the knot in his chest tighten in a specific way. Professional people were harder to reason with than amateurs because professionals had already done the reasoning before they arrived. Lights on in the ground floor, 2 windows, the main room and what would be the kitchen. He counted what he could see. 1 man on the exterior northeast corner of the building, smoking facing the water. His body language was relaxed in the way of someone who has been told the situation is controlled. That told Damian something. He moved to the east side, staying in the trees until he had an angle on the lit windows. Through the main room window, he could see 2 more men. One seated, one standing near the far wall with his arms crossed. Between them, in a chair that had been pulled to the center of the room, was Elena. She was upright. She was not restrained that he could see. Her hands were in her lap, and her posture was the posture he knew. Back straight, chin level. The physical expression of a woman who has decided that whatever is happening to her, she will not perform fear for anyone in the room. He felt something in his chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. He did the math. 1 outside, 2 inside with Elena, the 3rd car. He needed to find the 4th man. Calloway wouldn't send 3 people to collect a pregnant woman. There would be 4 minimum, possibly 5. He moved along the tree line toward the south side of the building and found the 4th man on the back porch, also smoking, looking at his phone with the loose attention of someone waiting for something to happen rather than making anything happen himself. Younger than the others, early 30s. The phone in his hand was more interesting to him than his surroundings, which was a professional failure that Damian filed and moved past. He circled back. One at the northeast corner, one at the south porch, 2 inside, 4 accounted for. He stood in the trees and breathed and looked at the house and thought about what he had, which was 1 weapon, and the element of surprise and the particular disadvantage of being alone. And what he needed, which was Elena out of that building, without either of them being shot. He took out his phone and texted Webb the address with 2 words, "Come now." Then he put the phone on silent, put it in his jacket pocket, and stepped out of the tree line. He walked toward the northeast corner as if he were supposed to be there. This was the oldest technique available to him, and it worked because the man at the corner was not expecting anyone to approach from the tree line on foot. And by the time he processed what he was seeing and started to reach, Damian was close enough that the reach didn't complete. He took the man down without the weapon, quietly, efficiently, with the minimum necessary force to produce unconsciousness, which he had learned at 24 from a man who had learned it in the military and who had charged him $500 for the education. He eased him to the ground against the building's north wall and checked his pulse. Strong. He would wake up with a headache and nothing worse. He took the man's radio, earpiece still in. He put it in his own ear. He moved to the south porch, and the younger man with the phone didn't register him until he was already on the porch steps, and by then the 9mm was level, and the situation was clear. The younger man's phone dropped. He put his hands up with the speed of someone who has weighed the options and made a sensible decision. "Sit down," Damian said quietly. "On the ground, don't reach for anything." The man sat. He was looking at Damian with an expression that was recalculating rapidly, trying to place the face, trying to map it onto whatever briefing he had received. Damian could see the moment it landed. The eyes changed. "You are." "I know who I am," Damian said. "Where are the others inside?" "2 of them." "Anyone else on the property?" A hesitation. The man was deciding how much the situation had changed and which direction the calculation ran. Damian waited with the weapon level and no expression on his face, which was sometimes more effective than urgency. "1 more," the man said. "Upstairs. He came with us, but he is not one of us." "Explain that." "He was already here when we arrived. He had a key. He said he was the advance." Damian looked at him for a moment. "What does he look like?" The man described him. Damian listened to the description and felt something cold move through him that was entirely different from anything he had felt that morning. The description was precise. Dark suit, silver at the temples, compact build. A man who had arrived at a property that only Damian knew about before Calloway's people got there using a key. Ricci had not sent those coordinates as a warning. He had sent them as a location confirmation. He had been in communication with Calloway's people in real time from the room where Webb had left him, and he had told them where Elena was going to be moved to, and then he had gone there ahead of them, which meant Ricci was not in the operation center, which meant Webb's controlled situation had already failed before Damian had made the drive south. He zip-tied the man on the porch with the restraints from his own belt. A standard field kit his driver kept in the vehicle, which Damian had taken before leaving the car, and went inside through the back door. The kitchen was empty. Through the internal doorway, he could hear voices from the main room. He moved along the kitchen wall to the doorway and stopped there and listened. One of the 2 men inside was speaking. His voice was professionally calm, in a way that suggested he had done versions of this conversation before. "Nobody is asking you to make any decisions right now. We are just waiting." Elena's voice, "For what?" "For Mr. Calloway to call. And when he calls, then we will know what the next step is." The next step being what exactly? A pause. "That is not something I have visibility into." That is a very careful way of saying you don't know if I am going to be hurt. Her voice was exactly level. No tremor, no pleading. The voice of a woman in a chair in the center of a room who has decided that the only currency she has left is composure, and she is going to spend it carefully. "I am 4 months pregnant. Whoever you work for knows that. I would like you to factor it into whatever you are planning. Mrs. Ashford, I am not asking for your feelings about it. I am telling you that If anything happens to this pregnancy because of what you do in the next hour, there is no version of any agreement your employer makes with my husband that protects you from the consequences. That is not a threat. It is information. Damian stood in the doorway and listened to his wife conduct herself in a hostage situation with more precision than most trained negotiators he had worked with. And something in him broke open in a way that 22 years of built architecture could not entirely contain. He stepped into the room. Both men turned. The seated one reached, and Damian moved the weapon to him specifically and said, "Don't," in a voice that had nothing performative in it, and the reach stopped. Elena turned in her chair. Her eyes found him and moved across his face with the rapid assessment of someone checking for damage. And he saw the exact moment she registered that he was alone, that he had come to a property with 4 of Calloway's people, without backup, without a team, with a single weapon, and what appeared to be a plan that he was inventing as it went. Her expression said several things simultaneously. He read all of them. He would deal with them later. "Stand up," he said to both men. "Hands where I can see them. You are going to walk to the kitchen, and you are going to sit on the floor, and you are going to wait for the people who are coming in the next 20 minutes. He looked at the seated man specifically. "I know you are calculating whether you can close the distance before I can manage both of you. I want you to think about what I have already done to the 2 men outside and factor that into your calculation." The calculation ran visibly across the man's face. He stood. Both of them moved to the kitchen. Damian moved Elena to the far corner of the main room and positioned himself between her and the kitchen doorway. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Her voice was contained. "You came alone. I came fast. Alone was the cost of fast." "That is a very Damian answer, Elena." He looked at her directly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She was wearing the clothes she had been in on the train, a dark jacket, dark trousers, the practical clothing of someone who had packed to disappear. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she was holding them still through deliberate effort. "I am going to get you out of here, but there is someone upstairs, and I need to deal with that before Webb's people arrive. And I need you to tell me if you are capable of moving quickly if I tell you to. I am 4 months pregnant, not incapacitated. A beat. Who is upstairs?" He looked at her. She read it in his face before he said it. He watched her read it, watched the sequence move through her eyes, the calculation and the arrival, and then the very particular stillness that followed. "Vincent," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "He was here when I arrived with them. He was standing in the front room like he was expected. I thought," she stopped, "I thought he was here because you sent him. He sent himself." He looked toward the ceiling, listening. No sound from the floor above. He has been running this from inside the organization for almost a year. Calloway was the outside piece. Richie was the inside piece. They built it together to remove you, to remove me and eliminate the air complication. He said it plainly. He had decided somewhere on the drive south that if he was going to ask anything from her after everything he had taken, plain truth was the minimum he owed. You being pregnant made the timeline urgent. You leaving gave them the opportunity. They needed you away from the house and from my protection before they could move. Elena looked at him. Her expression was not shock. She had been processing since the car pulled up to the safe house. What was in her face now was something more specific and more devastating than shock. It was the expression of a woman who has already made one enormous, difficult decision about her future and is being handed information that makes that decision simultaneously more justified and more complicated. "You built an empire," she said quietly, "and someone inside it spent a year engineering a way to take your wife hostage to control you. And you came here alone." She paused. "What was the plan, Damian? Get you out, then figure out Richie. That is not a plan. That is a sequence. It is what I had." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stood from the chair and walked to the foot of the stairs and looked up. "Vincent," she called. Silence from the floor above. "I know you are up there," Damian told me. Her voice carried up the stairwell without strain. "Come down." Damian moved to the base of the stairs beside her. Footsteps on the floor above, then on the stairs. Richie came down slowly, both hands visible, no weapon drawn. Either because he didn't have one, or because he had already decided that the situation had moved past the point where a weapon would help him. He looked at Damian and then at Elena, and his face was doing something that Damian had never seen it do in 22 years. It was coming apart. Not dramatically, not into tears or visible anguish, but in the small incremental way of a structure whose load-bearing elements have been quietly removed, and which is only now, under the specific weight of this specific moment, beginning to show the damage. Elena, he said. He had known her for 12 years. She had been a presence in his professional life since her marriage, at gatherings and dinners, and the particular social occasions that the organization required, and he had always treated her with the deference he gave to things that were important to Damian. I want you to understand. Don't, she said, flat and precise in a way that stopped him as cleanly as a wall. I am not interested in what you want me to understand. I am interested in what you are going to do right now. She looked at him steadily. The men downstairs, Calloway's people, they are waiting for a call. When Calloway calls and nobody answers because you are standing here instead of managing the situation, what does he do? Ricci blinked. He had not expected to be questioned. He had expected Damian's fury or calculation, or the controlled violence of a man who has been betrayed and knows exactly what to do about it. He had not expected Elena to be the one asking operational questions in a hostage situation. She had been removed from approximately 10 minutes ago. He will send more people, Ricci said. How many and how long? An hour, maybe less. He has a team staged at the Route 9 motel, the seaside, 6 miles north. He glanced at Damian, 8 men. Damian looked at him. You knew the staging location. I helped plan it. And you didn't give it to Webb when he took your phone. I gave Webb my primary phone. I had a second. The admission was flat. Not proud, not ashamed. Just information delivered by a man who has arrived at the far end of something and is managing the final steps. Damian, I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Then say it clearly. Ricci's hands dropped to his sides. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back up. Calloway's arrangement, the transition I built, it was never what I told you it was. I told you it was about organizational direction, about leadership. He paused. It wasn't. Calloway doesn't do managed transitions. He does absorptions. What I was selling him was the full architecture. The accounts, the operations, the port agreements, the federal protection relationships, everything. Another pause, harder this time. And Elena, the heir issue, he was never going to allow. He stopped. Say it, Damian said. He was going to resolve it cleanly. Ricci's voice had gone to something barely above a murmur. I told him I wouldn't authorize harm to Elena. He said he understood. But Damian, he looked up, and his eyes were direct in the way of a man who has decided that the last honest thing he does will at least be honest. I knew what resolve it cleanly meant when he said it, and I told myself it was abstract, and he stopped again. The room was very quiet. Elena said with a steadiness that cost her something visible, he was going to have me killed. Ricci said nothing, which was the answer. Damian stood in the silence of that and felt it move through him. Not the cold thing, not the controlled architecture. Something underneath all of that. Something that existed in the part of him that was not a criminal organization's leader, not a strategist, not a man who read silence like a financial statement. Something that was just a man standing in a room with his pregnant wife and the person who had arranged for both of them to be eliminated. His hand came up and he hit Ricci once hard open hand across the face, which was in some ways worse than a fist because it was the gesture of someone who has gone past the controlled response into something more primitive than anger. Ricci's head snapped to the side. He didn't fall. He absorbed it and turned back and said nothing and didn't raise his hands. That is the only one, Damian said. His voice was almost even. Almost. Because we need what is in your head in the next hour. Ricci nodded. His cheek was already reddening. Calloway's team at the motel. 8 men. What are they armed with? Standard sidearms. Possibly 2 with long rifles. He uses a 2-man cover element on extractions. This was an extraction. Yes. When I walked in here and neutralized 4 of his people, I turned it into something else. He won't try to extract anymore. Damian was thinking out loud now. Not for Ricci's benefit, but because the shape of the problem required it. He will switch to containment and then elimination. Cleaner narrative, Moretti and his wife. A coastal property. A power struggle inside the organization. He can make it look internal. Yes, Richie's voice barely there. That was the contingency. If the extraction failed, the contingency was. Burn it, Damian said. I know. I would have planned the same. He looked at the windows. The light outside had shifted. Late afternoon now, the gray coastal light starting to flatten. Webb. He pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from Webb. He called back. Webb picked up on the first ring. Where are you? Route 9 Estate. I have Elena. I have Ricci. And 4 of Calloway's people subdued. I need you herein. He looked at Ricci. 40 minutes from the motel to here, Ricci said. If they move when the check-in fails. 30 minutes, Damian told Webb. And I need you to hit the Seaside Motel on Route 9 North, 6 miles up the road. Calloway has 8 people staged there. I need them contained before they get the call to move. A pause. Damian, I don't have enough people to. You have the 14 names Ricci gave us. Those people are out of their positions. That frees up everyone else. I need you to move them now. I can get 6 to the motel in 25 minutes. 8, maybe. Do it. And Marcus, he paused. Call the task force. A longer pause. Say that again. Agent Harker, the federal task force. Call him. Tell him you have a location with evidence and personnel related to the Calloway Syndicate's operations in this state, and that we are prepared to cooperate fully with securing the scene. Don't give him my name yet. Tell him the information is coming through a confidential source and that he has a 30-minute window before it moves. Webb's breathing on the line, steady processing. If I call Harker, this changes everything. There is no walking that back, I know. He looked at Elena. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Not approval, not surprise. Something more like the slow, careful adjustment of someone who is watching a person they thought they knew do something they did not expect. I know, call him. He ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Ricci and then at Elena, and then at the windows where the coastal light was going gray and flat, and the pines were moving slightly in a wind off the water. You called the federal task force, Elena said. Yes, Damian, that is the end of the organization. I know what it is. He looked at her directly. You wrote in the letter that you wouldn't raise a child in a world where loyalty means nothing. This is me figuring out what loyalty actually means. He paused. I am about 2 years late, but I am doing it now. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still folded in front of her, and they were not entirely steady anymore, which was the first visible crack in the composure she had been maintaining since the car at the safe house. The men at the motel, 8 armed men. If Webb doesn't reach them in time, he will reach them. But if he doesn't, then we have a problem we deal with when it arrives. He moved to the window and looked out at the access road through the pines. Nothing moving yet. The light was going. Ricci, who had been standing against the wall with his reddened cheek and his hands at his sides, looked up. Calloway's check-in window. How frequent? Every 30 minutes on an active operation. Last check-in was when they arrived here. Probably when they confirmed they had Elena. That would have been, Ricci thought, an hour and 15 minutes ago. Maybe the next window is due in 15 minutes. 15 minutes before 8 armed men at a motel 6 miles north received no response and switched from waiting to moving. Damian turned from the window. He looked at the room. Elena against the far wall, Ricci against the nearer one. The sounds from the kitchen of 2 subdued men who were going to get louder when they understood that the situation was deteriorating. He looked at all of it, and he thought about 22 years of an organization that he had built, and the life he had constructed inside it, and the man he had been for all of that time. The man who kept his hands steady, and his voice quiet, and managed every crisis through leverage and intelligence, and the particular controlled force of someone who had learned that power was about never letting anyone see the cost of maintaining it. And he thought about Elena in a chair in the center of this room with her back straight and her chin level, while 2 of Calloway's men waited for a phone call that would determine whether she lived through the afternoon. He had built all of this, every piece of it. The organization and the leverage and the architecture of subsidiaries and the 22 years of calculated decisions. And it had produced this room this afternoon, his wife in that chair, and a consigliere who had spent a year arranging for her to be quietly eliminated because she was carrying an heir to something that a man named Calloway wanted to absorb. There was a version of him that would have fought to hold it, that would have managed this situation the way he had managed 100 others, through force and leverage and the patient application of pressure until the structure held. He could feel that version of himself like a familiar coat. He knew exactly how it fit. He wasn't going to put it on. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "When this is done, when Webb gets here and Harker gets here and the night is over, I am going to tell you everything. Not the version I decide you can handle. Everything." He stopped. "And then whatever you decide about us, about what comes next, I will accept it. I won't manage it. I won't apply pressure. I won't send people to find you." He looked at her steadily. "You have my word, for whatever it is worth, right now." She looked back at him. Her eyes were steady and tired and clear in the way that comes after a person has already done the hardest work of deciding something and is now living in the aftermath of the decision. "It is worth something," she said quietly. "Not everything, but something." Outside through the pines, headlights appeared on the access road. Not Webb's people. Too fast. Too many of them. The silhouettes of 2 vehicles coming through the trees at the speed of men who had not received a check-in and had decided not to wait for the 30-minute window to expire. Calloway's team from the motel had moved 12 minutes early. Damian looked at the lights coming through the trees, and then at the weapon in his hand, and then at Ricci, and then at Elena. And the equation was completely clear to him in the way that equations become clear when all the variables have finally resolved and the only thing left is the answer, however much you don't like what it is. He was one man with one weapon and an empty house against 8 professionals. And the only thing standing between his wife and whatever Calloway's contingency plan specified was the fact that he was still standing in this room and had not yet run out of moves. He looked at Ricci. "You are going to go outside and tell them the situation has changed," he said. "You are going to buy me 10 minutes. Ricci stared at him. "They will know something is wrong the moment I walk out without the others." "Yes," Damian said. "So be convincing." He held Ricci's gaze. "This is what 22 years buys you, Vincent. The chance to stand between my wife and the thing you built." Ricci looked at him. Then he looked at Elena. She was watching him with an expression that had no mercy in it, and no hatred either. Something more exhausting than both, which was simply the clear-eyed assessment of someone who knows exactly what a person has done, and is waiting to see if they have anything left that resembles who they once were. Ricci straightened his jacket. He turned toward the front door. His hand was on the handle when he stopped and said without turning around, "I am sorry, Elena." She said nothing. He opened the door and walked into the headlights. Damian moved Elena to the back of the house, through the kitchen, past the 2 men zip-tied on the floor, who watched him with the focused attention of people who understood the situation, had changed significantly, and were trying to figure out in which direction. He positioned her in the utility room at the back corner of the house. No windows, stone exterior wall, the most structurally solid position in the building. He gave her the second weapon from the man he had disarmed on the south porch. She took it with steady hands and checked the chamber with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been married to a dangerous man long enough to learn the practical things. "Don't come out until Webb or until you hear me call your name," he said. "And if I don't hear your name." He looked at her. "Then you make a different decision, but make sure you hear nothing first." She looked back at him in the utility room light. She looked exactly as she had for 12 years, clear-eyed and tired and more capable than anyone gave her credit for, carrying something enormous with a steadiness that he had spent years taking for granted. "Don't do anything stupid," she said. "I mean that specifically. I know what you mean." He shut the utility room door and turned back toward the front of the house, where Vincent Ricci was standing in the headlights of Calloway's vehicles, buying time with the last credible thing he had left. And Damian moved along the interior wall toward the front room window and looked out at what was coming, and understood with complete clarity that the man who walked out of this house tonight, if he walked out, was not going to be the same man who had walked into it. The headlights cut through the pine dark, and the voices outside were short and clipped, and Ricci's voice among them was steady, in the way of a man who has already accepted what this costs. And from somewhere behind the second vehicle came the sound of a door opening that Ricci's voice could not cover, and Damian moved. The door at the back of the second vehicle opened, and the man who came out was not one of Calloway's field operatives. Damian recognized him from the window in the half-second before the man cleared the vehicle's shadow and stepped into the headlight wash. He had seen him twice in person, once at a territorial negotiation 3 years ago, and once at a funeral for a mutual associate, where they had acknowledged each other from across a room and said nothing, because there was nothing yet that needed saying. Emmett Calloway was 56 years old, and he was built like a man who had started heavy and burned it down to something denser over decades of a particular kind of work. Gray suit, no tie. The face of someone who had long ago stopped performing anything for anyone. He had come himself. Damian absorbed this in the time it took to cross from the window to the interior wall. Calloway coming personally meant one of two things. Either he trusted no one else to manage the final stage of something this significant, or the situation had deteriorated enough in the last hour that he needed to be present to control the outcome. Probably both. Ricci was talking. Damian could hear the cadence through the wall, controlled, measured, buying seconds with the currency of a man who had spent 22 years being convincing in difficult rooms. He heard Calloway's voice respond shorter, asking something. Ricci's answer. Then a pause that was long enough to be concerning. Then Calloway said in a voice that carried through the exterior wall, with the flat precision of a man who was done with the negotiation phase, "Where is she?" Ricci said something Damian couldn't catch. "Vincent." Calloway's voice dropped. "I know someone came. I know at least 2 of my people outside are down. I can see the northeast corner from here." A pause. "Let's stop." Silence outside. Damian moved through the interior. He had approximately 30 seconds before Calloway sent men in both doors simultaneously, which was the only tactically sensible response to a confirmed hostile presence in a building with 2 access points. He had 1 weapon, 7 rounds remaining after the exterior work, and a position that was defensible for maybe 90 seconds against 8 professionals if they came in coordinated. He needed to change the equation. He went to the 2 men zip-tied on the kitchen floor. Both were watching him with the focused, calculating attention of people who have been on the ground long enough to understand the shape of what was happening outside. He crouched in front of the nearer one, the man who had been standing in the main room, late 30s, with the particular stillness of someone who had been in difficult situations before. "Your employer just arrived," Damian said. "Quiet, even, which means this is no longer a containment operation. You understand what I am saying." The man's jaw tightened. "I understand. You have a choice. You can stay on the floor and let whatever happens outside come through those doors. Or you can help me walk out of this building, and I will personally vouch for your cooperation to the federal agents who are going to be here in," he checked, 12 minutes. The man looked at him. "I called them 40 minutes ago. They are coming for Calloway's operation, not mine. Your name doesn't have to be in anything." He kept his eyes level. "But you need to decide now." A pause. The man's partner was watching both of them. Then the first man said, "Cut the tie." Damian cut both of them. He handed the second man the weapon from his waistband, keeping his own, and said, "The back door. Anyone comes through it who isn't me or a woman, you treat it as hostile." He looked at both of them. "My wife is in the utility room. She stays safe. That is the only non-negotiable." Both men nodded. He didn't know if they would hold. He had nothing better. He went back to the front room. Outside, Ricci had stopped talking. The silence had the particular quality of a situation that has arrived at its terminal point. Past negotiation, past maneuvering. At the place where the next thing that happens is physical. Damian opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The headlights hit him full in the face. He kept his eyes open and his weapon down at his side. Not raised, not holstered, present. He could see Calloway in the wash of light 10 meters away, flanked by 2 men. Behind them, back by the vehicles, 3 more. The remaining 3 would be cycling around to the back and the sides. Calloway looked at him for a moment then. Damian Moretti. Not surprise, not anger. The tone of a man who had prepared for several contingencies. and this was one of them. Emmett. He stepped off the porch onto the gravel. The stones shifted under his feet, and the sound was loud in the coastal quiet. You came a long way. I had interests that required personal attention. Calloway's eyes moved over him, assessing, mapping the weapon at his side, reading the posture. Where are my people? Safe. All of them. Nobody has been seriously hurt. He stopped walking at 6 meters, close enough to talk, far enough that the 2 flanking men would need to cross distance if they moved. I want to keep it that way. That is a generous posture for a man standing alone in front of 8 people. I have got 2 of yours in the kitchen who are having second thoughts about their employment, and my people are 12 minutes out. He let that land. So let's use the time productively. Calloway looked at him steadily. He had the eyes of someone who had been reading people across tables and across parking lots and across moments exactly like this one for 30 years. Vincent told you everything he did, and you think that changes the calculation. I think it clarifies it. Damian kept his voice level. The headlights were hot on his face. He could feel the gravel under his shoes, the weight of the weapon in his right hand, the specific quality of the night air off the water, salt and cold, and the particular smell of coastal pine that he would remember for the rest of his life, regardless of how this ended. You spent a year building something inside my organization. You used my consigliere, my personal life, my marriage. You put a woman in my path, and you handed my wife's location to people with a contingency order. He paused. That is a lot of infrastructure for a man who already runs a significant operation. What did you actually want? Calloway was quiet for a moment. One of the flanking men shifted slightly. Calloway's hand came up, a small gesture barely visible, and the man went still. The Northern Port Agreements, Calloway said. Your federal protection relationships. The 3 union contracts your father established that nobody in this region has been able to replicate in 30 years. He said it the way an accountant itemizes assets. No apology, no performance. The organization itself is secondary. It is the infrastructure underneath it. Then you should have come to me directly. I did 3 years ago through intermediaries. Damian remembered. An approach through a mutual associate. A real estate man who did business on both sides that he had declined without extensive consideration. I said no. You said no. Calloway's voice was even. So I found another way. You found Vincent. Vincent found me. A pause. He approached my people 14 months ago. He presented a proposal. I evaluated it and I agreed to support it. His eyes stayed on Damian's face. I want you to understand that this was never personal. You had a contingency order on my pregnant wife. And Damian's voice did not change. Somehow that was worse than if it had. You want me to hear that it wasn't personal. Calloway said nothing for a moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite discomfort, but occupied the same address. The air situation created a structural complication in the transition. My legal team advised. Stop. Damian took a step forward. 1 step, which brought him to 5 meters, and made both flanking men tense in a way that was visible even through the headlight wash. I am going to tell you what is going to happen. Not what I would like, not what I am proposing. What is going to happen? He stopped. Federal agents are going to arrive at this property in 11 minutes. Everything on this property, the people, the vehicles, the communication records from tonight becomes federal evidence. Your people in the kitchen, your people on the ground outside, the man you sent to ride the train this morning. All of it. He kept his eyes on Calloway, unless you make a different decision in the next 2 minutes. You called federal agents to your own property. I called them to a property where Emmett Calloway was operating a kidnapping and a murder contingency against a civilian, against a pregnant woman. He held Calloway's gaze. You think about how that reads in a federal filing. You think about what your operation looks like in the northern cities after that story gets told in a courtroom. Calloway was very still. Here is what I am offering, Damian said. You take your people and you leave this property in the next 90 seconds. You do not contact anyone in my organization, anyone connected to my organization, or my family in any form going forward. In exchange, I don't give your name to Agent Harker when he arrives. The people in the kitchen can say what they want. That is their choice. But the documentation I have on your involvement, I don't put it in front of the federal task force tonight. He paused. That is the offer. It has a 90-second clock. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the pines behind the vehicles, something moved. An animal. The wind. One of Calloway's perimeter people repositioning. The headlights hummed. The salt air moved. Calloway looked at him for a long time, not calculating exactly. More like a man reading a document and finding that it says something he didn't expect it to say. "You would let me walk," Calloway said slowly. "I would let you walk tonight. What happens after that is between you and whoever you have made enemies of in 30 years of this business. I am not your only problem, Emmett. I am just the one in front of you right now." Another silence. Then Calloway said to neither of the flanking men in particular, "Get the others." The flanking men moved. Calloway stood where he was for another moment, looking at Damian across the gravel and the headlight wash. And the expression on his face was something that had no clean name. Not respect and not defeat and not the particular satisfaction of a man who has found a workable exit. Something older than all of those. "Vincent," Calloway said. He was looking at Ricci, who had been standing to Damian's left in silence since Damian came out the door. "You are staying." Ricci said nothing. "He stays," Damian said. "He is cooperating with the federal investigation." Calloway looked at Ricci for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back to the second vehicle. His people consolidated from the perimeter. The three who had been cycling around the building, appearing from the south and east sides, moving efficiently. No wasted motion. The vehicles started. Gravel under tires. The headlights swung as the first vehicle turned on the access road, and the pine trees caught the light and threw it back. Damian stood on the gravel and watched them go, and did not move until the sound of the engines had diminished to nothing in the coastal dark. Then his legs did something they hadn't done in approximately 20 years, which was to briefly become unreliable. He locked his knees and stayed upright through the specific force of will that had kept him standing in difficult situations since he was a young man. And he breathed, and the salt air came in off the water, and the pines moved and the property was quiet. Ricci was still standing beside him. His face in the sudden dark with the headlights gone was unreadable. "He is going to come back," Ricci said. "Not tonight, but he doesn't make deals like that and honor them." "I know." Damian put the weapon in his jacket. "But tonight I needed him gone, not managed. Tonight was about Elena." He turned toward the house. "Come inside." He went to the utility room door. He knocked twice, the way he used to knock on her studio door in the early years when she would work late, and he didn't want to startle her. An old gesture that came back to him without thought. The door opened. Elena was standing with the weapon at her side, held the way a person holds something they know how to use, but are relieved not to have needed. She looked at him. Her eyes moved over him fully, checking, cataloging the rapid inventory of someone who has been standing in a stone room, listening to the sounds outside, and operating entirely on information she couldn't see. "You are bleeding," she said. He looked down his left forearm. He had caught something on the doorframe when he moved through the house fast, or possibly from the exterior work. He hadn't registered it at the time. A cut, not deep, but it had run down his wrist and soaked into his shirt cuff. "It is minor." "Sit down, Elena. Sit." She moved to the kitchen and came back with a dish towel, and he sat at the table with the two formerly zip-tied men watching from across the room with the careful non-expression of people who have decided to be invisible. And Elena wrapped his forearm with the brisk efficiency of someone who has decided that this specific task is what she is doing right now, and everything else can wait. Her hands were steady, steadier than his. "Calloway left," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." Ricci said the same thing. "Ricci is correct." She tied off the towel. She didn't let go of his arm. She was looking at the wrapped forearm, and her jaw was set in a particular way that he recognized as the external expression of something she was working through internally. One of those interior processes that she had always conducted at a depth he could read the surface of, but never fully see into. "Elena," she looked up. "I am sorry." He said it plainly. No architecture around it. No managed delivery. Just the two words in the tone of a man who has arrived through an extremely specific day at the exact point where there is nothing left to say except the thing itself. "For all of it. The affair. The years I spent maintaining a life that made you a target." The fact that you had to write that letter alone, and leave alone, and that I didn't. I didn't see what I was doing to you until it was already done." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still on his arm. The kitchen was very quiet. From somewhere distant came the sound of vehicles on the Route 9 highway. Webb's people probably or possibly the first federal response. The ordinary mechanical sounds of a situation resolving into its consequences. "I know," she said. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Just an acknowledgement of the statement's accuracy, which was its own kind of honesty. "I am going to dismantle it," he said. "The organization, the operations. I am going to give Harker everything he needs to build cases against every illegal structure we are running. The legitimate businesses, the clean assets, I will liquidate and cooperate fully." He paused. "It means prison time, probably. Negotiated, but real." She was very still. "How much time? I don't know yet. Harker and I haven't had that conversation, but I am not going into it trying to minimize. I am going in trying to give him enough that he can close cases that have been running for years. That is worth something in a negotiation." "It is worth something," she said. "It might not be enough. It might not be." He looked at her. "But I am not asking you to wait. I am not asking you to, whatever happens after, whatever you decide about us, I am not making it contingent on anything from you. I just want you to know what I am doing and why." She looked at him for another long moment. Outside the sound of vehicles on the access road, multiple vehicles, the organized sound of people arriving with a purpose. Blue light strobed briefly through the window as the first federal vehicle came through the trees. Elena looked at the window, then back at him. "The baby," she said, not as a question. "Yes," he said. "That is why." She absorbed this. Her hands finally moved from his arm. She sat back in her chair and folded them in her lap and looked at the kitchen table between them. A woman who had been running since 4 in the morning and had been collected by strangers and driven to a house and had sat in a chair in the center of a room and conducted herself with more discipline than most professionals he had worked with, and who was now in a kitchen with a dish towel on her husband's arm and federal lights coming through the window. "I am going to need time," she said. "A significant amount of it, I know. And I am going to need the truth ongoing, not edited. You will have it. And if you go to prison—" She stopped. Her jaw worked slightly. "The child is going to know who its father is. Not the version, the actual person." She looked at him. "And whether or not that person is someone worth knowing, that is going to be determined by what you do between now and when that child is old enough to ask questions. Do you understand what I am saying?" "Yes," he said. "Completely." A knock at the front door. Webb's voice calling his name. Damian stood. He looked down at Elena, and she was looking up at him with the expression he had been trying to name since the beginning of the day. The one he had first seen across a room at a charity event 12 years ago when she had laughed at something he said, and he had been completely undone by it. He understood now what that expression was. It was not love, and it was not hope exactly. It was the expression of a person who has decided to do something difficult with full knowledge of the cost. She had made that decision 12 years ago. He was only now catching up. He went to the door and opened it. Webb stood on the porch with 3 of his people, and behind them on the access road, 2 federal vehicles with Agent Harker visible beside the lead car, hands in his pockets, waiting with the particular patience of a man who has been building a case for 18 months and is willing to take another 5 minutes. Webb looked at Damian, at the dish towel on his arm, at the blood on his shirt cuff. He looked at all of this and said nothing for a moment, reading the shape of the evening from the physical evidence of it. Calloway gone for now. Damian stepped onto the porch. Ricci is inside. He is cooperating. Full cooperation. He looked past Webb at Harker beside the federal vehicle. "Give me a minute with my wife. Then I will go talk to him." Webb nodded. He stepped aside. Damian went back inside. Elena had stood up from the kitchen table. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with the dish towel in her hands and the federal lights coming through the windows in the intermittent way of lights that are present but not urgent. Present as a statement of arrival, not emergency. He stopped in front of her. He did not reach for her. He had not earned that yet, and he knew it. "When this is over," he said, "and I am on the other side of whatever comes next, I want to build something different, something clean. I don't know what it looks like yet. He paused. But I want to build it with you if you will let me. She looked at him. The federal lights moved across her face in the intermittent way, and the coastal wind came through the window that someone had left open, and the pines moved outside, and the whole evening pressed against the moment with the weight of everything that had happened since sunrise. She said, "Ask me again when you have done it." Not yes. Not something harder than both. A door left open by a woman who had written a letter in the dark and disappeared without a trace and been collected by strangers and held in a room and stood in a utility room with a weapon, while her husband walked out to face 8 men and who was still here in this kitchen with a dish towel in her hands. He nodded. He turned and walked back to the front door and stepped off the porch and crossed the gravel toward Agent Harker. And with each step, the weight of what he was walking toward settled over him with the particular finality of a decision that has already been made and is only now being enacted. The organization, the infrastructure, 22 years of careful construction, all of it handed over piece by piece to a man with a federal badge who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Harker met him halfway across the gravel. He was 50, lean with the watchful economy of movement that came from years of this specific work. He looked at Damian without expression. "Mr. Moretti," he said. "Agent Harker." Damian stopped. "I am going to give you everything." Harker looked at him steadily. He was evaluating the statement the way he evaluated everything. For completeness, for the thing that wasn't being said, for the angle. He found none of those things. What he found was a man standing in the gravel outside a coastal estate in the late evening, with a dish towel tied around his forearm in the particular stillness of someone who has arrived at something after a very long time of moving in the wrong direction. Everything, Damian said. All of it. The accounts, the structures, the federal relationships that are going to embarrass some people in this building and the next 3 buildings after it. The Callaway connection, what Ricci built, the source of the Northern Port Agreements. He paused. In exchange, I want a negotiated arrangement that takes into account full and immediate cooperation. I am not asking for immunity. I am asking for an honest accounting. Harker was quiet for a moment then. That is going to take time to structure properly. I have time. Damian looked at the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Elena still standing in the doorway, the federal lights moving across her face. I have exactly as much time as this takes. Harker followed his gaze to the window. Then he looked back at Damian with the particular expression of someone who has been in this work long enough to have seen many things, and who recognizes in this specific moment something that doesn't fit the standard pattern. There is a lot of people who are going to be unhappy about this conversation, Harker said. I know. Damian looked back at him. Start with the unhappiest ones. Those are the cases worth building. Harker held his gaze for another moment. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a small recorder, looked at Damian once more with the question visible in his expression. And Damian nodded once, and Harker pressed record. The coastline came through the pines. The federal lights moved. In the access road behind the vehicles, at the edge of the tree line, something moved in the dark. A shape that paused at the edge of the headlight reach and then resolved into nothing, or into the wind, or into the particular quality of darkness at the edge of an illuminated space that always looks like something deciding whether to step forward. Callaway's people were gone, but gone was not the same as finished, and the recorder in Harker's hand was a beginning, not an ending. And somewhere behind the utility room door in a stone-walled room that smelled of salt and old wood, a child that had not yet been born was the reason for all of it. The reason Damian Moretti had stepped off a porch toward 8 armed men with 1 weapon, and the particular reckless clarity of someone who has finally located the thing he will not lose, regardless of what it costs him to keep. He opened his mouth and he began to talk, and the recorder took everything he gave it. And the night held still around him like something waiting to see if the words would be enough to hold back what was still out there in the dark. Still moving. Still Callaway. Callaway came back in February, not with vehicles and personnel and the organized infrastructure of a planned operation. He came back the way a man comes back when everything he built has been compromised, and he has nothing left except the oldest, simplest form of leverage. He came back alone in a rented car on a Tuesday morning when the city was gray with winter, and the federal proceedings that had been running since November had already consumed the better part of 3 organizations, 12 indictments, and enough documentation to keep Harker's task force employed for the next 4 years. He came to the hospital. Elena had gone into labor 6 weeks early. The baby came fast and difficult, in the way of things that arrive before they are fully ready. And Damian had been in a federal holding facility in the city's eastern district. Not a cell, a structured arrangement under the cooperation agreement. Harker had spent 2 months constructing. When Webb called him at 4 in the morning to tell him that Elena was at St. Catherine's and that it was happening now. Harker had authorized the temporary release personally. Damian had arrived at the hospital at 4:47 with 2 federal escorts who waited in the corridor with the particular professional discretion of people who understood that some moments required distance. He had been in the room when his son was born. 5 pounds 4 ounces, 3 weeks before the date the doctors had originally given them. The boy had come into the world making a sound that Damian would spend the rest of his life being unable to describe accurately. Not a cry exactly. Something more urgent than that. Something that said, "I am here," with a force entirely disproportionate to the size of the person making it. Elena had held him first. Damian had stood at the side of the bed and watched her hold this small, complete, furious person, and he had felt something crack open in him that had nothing to do with any of the things he had spent 43 years building walls against. It was not sentimental. It was not abstract. It was the specific physical experience of understanding, for the first time, what the word irreversible meant when applied to something you wanted, rather than something you feared. He had held the boy for 4 minutes before the federal escorts knocked on the doorframe. Those 4 minutes he kept. Nothing that happened after took them. Calloway arrived at the hospital at 9 in the morning, 3 days after the birth. He came through the main entrance with the unhurried manner of a man who had made a decision and was enacting it without uncertainty. He was alone, no visible weapon. He had the specific quality of someone who has been stripped of everything organizational and has arrived at whatever is underneath. Which in Calloway's case was a man in his late 50s who had spent 30 years building something that was now being dismantled in federal court, and who had come to the end of the available moves. Webb saw him on the lobby camera feed and called Damian's room. Damian was in the chair beside Elena's bed. Elena was sleeping. The boy was in the bassinet between them, sleeping also with the total commitment to sleep of someone who has decided that existence is exhausting and rest is the appropriate response. Damian looked at his phone, and then at Elena, and then at the boy, and then he stood up quietly and went into the corridor. He met Calloway at the elevator bank on the 3rd floor. The 2 federal escorts materialized from their positions at the end of the corridor. Visible, hands loose, not reaching, present as a statement. Calloway stopped when he saw them. He looked at the escorts and then at Damian, and the calculation ran across his face in the way of a man who has already done the calculation and is simply confirming that the answer is what he thought it was. "I am not here to make a problem," Calloway said. "I know." Damian looked at him in the corridor light with the hospital sounds around them. The low institutional hum, the distant intercom, the footsteps of morning shift nurses. Calloway looked smaller than he had in the headlight wash of a coastal estate in November. Not diminished exactly, reduced to actual size. "What do you want?" "Emmett." Calloway was quiet for a moment. He looked at the door to Elena's room. She had the baby 3 days ago. "Boy or girl?" "Boy." A pause. Calloway looked at the door for another moment. "I want you to know that the contingency, what Ricci told you about, the order on Elena." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I countermanded it before the estate. 2 days before, when I understood what Vincent had actually built and what the downstream of it was going to be." He looked at Damian directly. "I am not telling you that to ask for anything. I am telling you because it is true and because you should know it." Damian looked at him steadily. "You countermanded it, but your people still collected her from the safe house. That was collection, not the contingency." Vincent told them to move her when the Whitmore operation failed. I didn't authorize the collection. He ran it without my clearance. A pause. I found out when I arrived at the estate. Damian stood in the corridor and looked at Emmett Calloway and thought about what it was worth. This piece of information, this specific distinction between a murder order that was issued and a murder order that was countermanded before it was carried out. He thought about what it meant that a man had come to a hospital alone, without leverage, without organization, to deliver this particular clarification. He didn't know if it was true. He thought it probably was, which was not the same thing as knowing. The federal proceedings, Damian said, your name is in them. I know. There is documentation connecting your financial structures to the Ritchie arrangement going back 14 months. Harker has all of it. I know that too. Calloway's voice was even, the voice of a man who has accepted the shape of the remaining road. I have my own conversations happening with the federal people separate from yours. He paused. I came here because I spent 30 years in this business, and I did things that deserve the consequences they are getting. But I didn't come all this way to watch a pregnant woman get hurt. I want you to know that. He stopped. That is all. Damian looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, the boy's name is Thomas, after my father. Calloway absorbed this. He nodded once slowly with the gravity of someone receiving information that is being offered as something other than information. Then he turned and walked back to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with his back to Damian and his hands at his sides. And the elevator came, and he stepped in, and the doors closed, and he was gone. Damian stood in the corridor. One of the federal escorts came to his elbow, not intruding, just approximate. You want us to hold him downstairs? No, Damian said. Let him go. He went back into the room. Elena was awake. She had heard the door and was looking at him from the bed, with the particular alertness of a woman whose body is exhausted and whose mind is entirely operational. Who was it? Calloway. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Then what did he want? To tell me he countermanded the order on you before the estate. A pause. Elena looked at the window. The winter morning outside was the flat gray of a city that has not decided yet whether it will snow. Do you believe him? I think so. That is not the same as yes. No, it is not. He sat back in the chair beside her bed. It is what I have. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the bassinet, and whatever was in her expression softened in the specific way of someone who has encountered in the midst of a complicated morning something that is not complicated at all. He needs to eat, she said. I know. Damian leaned forward and lifted the boy from the bassinet with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been practicing this gesture for 3 days and is still not entirely confident, but is committed to the repetition. Thomas Moretti, 5 pounds and some ounces 3 weeks early, making up for it in volume and intensity, opened his eyes for a moment and looked at Damian with the unfocused, evaluating gaze of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is taking inventory. Damian held him and felt the weight of him and thought about nothing specific, just the weight. He handed him to Elena. He sat back. Outside, the winter morning held its flat gray, and the hospital sounds continued around them, and none of it touched the room. Vincent Ricci's cooperation agreement was finalized in March. He gave Harker's task force 14 months of documented internal communication, financial records, and operational logs covering not just the conspiracy against Damian, but 3 separate arrangements Ricci had built over the preceding decade. Side structures that had been running parallel to the Moretti organization for years. Invisible because Ricci had built them from a position of access, and because Damian had trusted him absolutely. The depth of it, when Harker laid it out in the cooperation debrief, was more than Damian had known, more than he had suspected even after the estate. Ricci had been architecturally duplicitous for at least 8 years. Not in opposition to Damian exactly, but in parallel, building something adjacent and derivative of everything Damian built, siphoning the edges, creating the conditions for a transition that had been in the abstract planning stage long before Calloway's people had ever been contacted. 22 years. A man could construct something remarkable in 22 years if he was patient. Ricci received 7 years under the cooperation agreement. He would serve 4 with good behavior. He was 50 years old. When he walked out, he would be 54, and the organization he had served would not exist in any form he would recognize. Damian's own agreement took longer to structure. Harker was thorough, and Damian was thorough, and the lawyers on both sides were thorough. And the result finalized in April was 3 years in a minimum security federal facility in exchange for complete cooperation, full asset disclosure, and the documented dismantling of every illegal structure under the Moretti umbrella. The legitimate businesses, the freight company, the 3 commercial properties, the holding structures that had clean revenue streams were restructured under Elena's name and the name of a trust established for Thomas. He reported to the facility on a Monday in early May. Elena drove him. She pulled up in front of the entrance and put the car in park, and they sat for a moment in the particular silence of a situation that has been discussed extensively and is now simply present and real. 3 years, she said. Could be less. The cooperation credit. 3 years, she said again, not correcting him, just holding the number. Yes. She was looking at the facility entrance. Her hands were on the wheel, 10 and 2, the careful grip of someone managing something by keeping their hands busy. Thomas was with her mother 2 hours north. It was the first time Elena had left him overnight since his birth in February, and she had called to check twice during the drive. He will be walking by the time you are out, she said. I know. Talking. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I am not going to tell him you are away on business. I have thought about it, and I am not going to do that. She turned and looked at him. When he is old enough to ask, I am going to tell him the truth, an age-appropriate version, but true. That his father made serious mistakes and is taking responsibility for them. She held his gaze. And that his father chose to do it this way instead of the other ways that were available. That is right, Damian said. Tell him exactly that. She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached into the back seat and retrieved a small paper bag and handed it to him. He looked inside. A photograph. The 3 of them taken in the hospital room the day after Thomas was born by one of the nurses who had offered. Elena in the bed with the boy in her arms and Damian beside her in the chair leaning forward. And the boy's eyes were open, and all 3 of them were looking at different things. Which was somehow the most honest photograph that had ever been taken of him. And beneath the photograph, a folded piece of paper. He looked at her. Open it later, she said. He put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at his hands, steady as always. Elena. She looked at him. Ask me again, he said. When I am out, ask me what I want to build. He paused. I will have an answer by then that is worth something. She held his gaze for a long moment. The May morning was clear outside, the first genuinely warm day the city had produced after a long winter, and the light was direct and honest, and showed everything without the softening that low-contrast light provides. She looked at him in that light, and she didn't smile, and she didn't offer anything easy. I will ask, she said. I am not promising the answer yet. I know. He got out of the car. He stood on the pavement and leaned back in through the open door. Take care of him. He has my attention 24 hours a day, she said. He doesn't need you to tell me. He almost smiled. I know that too. He closed the door. He stood on the pavement and watched her pull away. And he watched the car until it turned at the end of the facility entrance road and was gone into the morning. And then he turned and walked toward the entrance with the paper bag in one hand and nothing else. And the sound of the May morning around him. Birds somewhere in the tree line beyond the perimeter fence. Traffic on the road he had just arrived on. The ordinary sounds of a world continuing its business in complete indifference to what any individual person was walking toward. He went inside. He served 2 years and 8 months. The cooperation credit came through in the final accounting, and the federal judge who signed off on the early release had reviewed the full documentation of what Damian had provided and acknowledged in the dry language of judicial decisions that the assistance had been substantial and materially complete. He walked out on a Thursday morning in January. Elena was not at the facility entrance. They had discussed this and agreed. He took a car service to the city, and from the city he took the train north to the town 2 hours up the coast, where Elena had moved when Thomas was 4 months old. A small town, not one connected to anything in the organization's former geography, not one that appeared in any document from the previous chapter. She had chosen it herself, and she had not consulted him because he had been in the facility and also because she didn't need to. He arrived at the station in the early afternoon. The January light was low and clear, and the town was the kind of place where the sea was visible from the main street. And the buildings were older than the city he had come from, and everything moved at a pace that had nothing to do with leverage or urgency. He walked. He had the address. She had written it in the letter in the paper bag. The letter he had read in the facility on the first night and had read again regularly for 2 years and 8 months, and which he had memorized not deliberately, but through repetition, the way you memorize things that matter. The letter was shorter than the one she had left at the hotel. 6 sentences. He could have recited all 6 in any order. The house was on a street 3 blocks from the water. White clapboard, 2 stories, a front porch with a wooden railing that needed repainting. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch steps, too large for Thomas at almost 3 years old, which meant Elena had bought ahead, which was something she had always done. Plan forward, account for what was coming. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house for a moment. The front door opened. Elena came onto the porch. She was wearing a gray sweater, and her hair was longer than he remembered, which was the kind of thing you didn't expect to notice, but did. She stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at him on the sidewalk, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then the door opened again, and Thomas came out at the velocity of a child who has somewhere to be, and no patience for the intervening distance. He was 2 years and 10 months old, solid and fast, with Elena's eyes and an expression of total focus on his face as he came down the porch steps and crossed the small front yard at a run. Damian crouched. He caught the boy with both hands, and the impact of a child running full speed into a crouching adult was considerable, and he absorbed it and held on. And Thomas was saying something that was not entirely coherent, the rapid, compressed speech of a very young child delivering information at the speed he was receiving it. And Damian held him and listened to all of it. He stayed crouched for a long time, longer than was physically comfortable. He didn't let go. When he finally stood, Thomas immediately began pulling at his hand in the direction of the porch, conveying through physical insistence that there was something inside the house that required immediate attention. Damian let himself be pulled. He looked up at Elena as he came up the porch steps, and she was watching him with the expression he had been carrying in his chest for 2 years and 8 months, clear-eyed and tired and more capable than anyone gave her credit for. And underneath all of that, something that was not yet certainty, but was no longer only distance. "Come in," she said. "It is cold." He came in. The house was warm, and it smelled of coffee, and the particular smell of a home that is lived in by a small child. A sensory texture compounded of things he couldn't individually identify, but that landed on him as complete and specific as a location on a map. Thomas was already at the far end of the front room, demonstrating something with a collection of wooden blocks arranged on the floor with the deliberate architecture of a project in progress. He was narrating the project to himself and to Damian simultaneously, and the narrative was complex and self-interrupting, and occasionally circled back to correct an earlier point. Damian sat on the floor beside him. He stayed on the floor for 40 minutes. Elena moved through the house around them, kitchen to the front room, up the stairs and back, the ordinary circulation of someone in their own space. And occasionally she appeared in the doorway and watched the two of them and said nothing and went back to what she was doing. At some point, Thomas fell asleep on the floor between 2 towers of blocks with the total abruptness of a child whose energy simply ceases. No transition, no warning, simply present and then horizontal. Damian sat beside him and didn't move for several minutes, watching the boy sleep with the committed attention of someone who has been waiting to do this specific thing for 2 years and 8 months and is not ready to stop. Elena came and stood in the doorway. "He does that," she said quietly. "Just drops. I can see. You can put him on the couch. He won't wake up." Damian lifted him carefully. The boy was heavier than Damian's memory of him. 2 years and 8 months of growth made a substantial physical difference, and it registered in his arms as something that was not quite shock, but was adjacent to it. All the time that had passed made concrete and measurable in the weight of a sleeping child. He put Thomas on the couch. He arranged the small blanket that was on the back of the couch over him, and the boy's face in sleep was the face of someone operating in a completely different category of existence. Total, uncomplicated, unafraid. He stood up. Elena was still in the doorway. He crossed the room and stopped a few feet from her, and they looked at each other in the low January light coming through the front windows. And everything that had happened between the hotel room and this doorway was present in the room with them. Not heavy exactly, but dense. The way old wood is dense, carrying its history and its grain. "You said you would ask me," he said. She looked at him. "Ask you what?" "What I want to build." A pause. She leaned against the doorframe, crossed her arms, not defensively, just the posture of someone settling into a conversation. "All right, what do you want to build?" He had had 2 years and 8 months to think about the answer, and he had thought about it extensively. And he had arrived at something that was not eloquent and not architecturally impressive, and would not have meant anything to the man he had been at 31 or 40, or even 43 on the morning he found a ring on hotel sheets. This, he said, he meant the house. He meant the sleeping boy on the couch, and the coffee smell, and the bicycle against the porch steps, and the low January light. He meant the ordinary texture of a life that had nothing in it that needed to be maintained through leverage or fear. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him with the same precision she had always brought to the task. Looking for the angle, the managed delivery. The version he had edited for palatability. She found none of those things. She found what was there, which was a man who had spent 3 years in a federal facility and the better part of a decade before that building something that had cost everyone around him more than he had understood until it was almost too late, and who was standing in her doorway with nothing left to offer except the answer she had asked him to wait until he had. "That is not very ambitious," she said finally. "No," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Then the foundation, the one you mentioned, supporting families leaving organized crime. You still want to do that." He had mentioned it in one of the letters he had written from the facility. She had not responded to that specific item in her replies. He had not raised it again. "Yes, if there is a legal structure that makes sense. I have some contacts from the cooperation process, people who work in that space who said they talk." She absorbed this. "That would require you to be in the city sometimes." "Some of the time, not most of it." He looked at her steadily. "This is where I want to be. The city work is work. This is where I want to be." She looked at him for another long moment. The afternoon was going. The January light was already beginning to lower. The short days of deep winter, and the front room was taking on the particular golden quality of late afternoon light in a house near the sea. "There is a room," she said finally. "The back bedroom upstairs. It has been a storage room. I have been meaning to clear it out." She held his gaze. "You could stay there for now. Not the room they had shared, a back bedroom for now." The most precise, the most honest, the most Elena-like offer he had ever been given, measured exactly to what was available, and not 1 gram more. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She uncrossed her arms and moved past him into the front room toward the kitchen. At the doorway, she stopped without turning around. "You will need to repaint the porch railing," she said. "It has been 2 winters without it, I saw. And Thomas has a doctor's appointment Thursday. I will need you to take him because I have a meeting that I can't move." She paused. "His doctor's name is Paulson. She has seen him since he was 6 months old. He likes her, but he doesn't like the waiting room. Bring something for him to do. I will." She moved into the kitchen. He heard the sound of the refrigerator, the small domestic sound of the ordinary afternoon resuming. He turned back to the front room. Thomas was still asleep on the couch, one arm thrown over his face, the blanket at his chin. The wooden block tower stood on the floor with the patient permanence of small constructions that have been completed and are waiting to be continued tomorrow. Damian sat in the chair beside the couch. He had nowhere to be for the rest of the afternoon. No operation to run, no leverage to apply, no architecture to maintain. The January light came through the windows and moved slowly across the floor, the way light moves when you have time to watch it. He sat with his son in the quiet house and listened to the sound of Elena in the kitchen and the distant sound of the sea through the old walls, and he did not move. The foundation was incorporated the following year under a name that had nothing in it connecting to anything he had previously been. It operated out of 2 offices, one in the city, one in the coastal town. In its first full year, it served 31 families. The second year, 87. By the 5th year, it had a staff of 12 in relationships with federal agencies and municipal organizations that had been built through the cooperation process and its aftermath. Damian worked 3 days in the city and 4 at home. He drove Thomas to school on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and he was there on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when Thomas came out. He repapered the porch railing that first January and replaced the rotted step on the south side of the porch that spring. He learned through repetition and the patient instruction of a 2-year-old who had very specific preferences about how things were done, the particular rituals of his son's daily life, the cup that was acceptable and the cup that was not, the stories that could be requested in any order, and the one that had to be last. The specific weight of a small hand reaching up without looking to confirm that someone is still there. Elena moved at her own pace through the months. She had her own work. She had taken a position with a maritime law firm in the coastal town, part-time at first and then more as Thomas got older, the revival of a professional life that the 12 years of the marriage's previous chapter had held in partial suspension. She was good at it. She had always been good at everything she decided to do, which was something he had always known and not always adequately acknowledged. She moved at her own pace, and he did not apply pressure, and he did not manage the timeline. And there were evenings in the second year when she would sit beside him on the porch after Thomas was in bed, and they would talk about the work and the foundation and what Thomas had said that day that required recording. And those evenings had a quality that he had not expected. Not the intensity of the early years of the marriage, not the careful distance of the years before the hotel room. Something quieter and more durable than both. She moved to the front bedroom in the 3rd year. She did not make an announcement. She moved her things on a Saturday while Thomas was at his grandmother's. And when Damian came home from the city that evening, the back bedroom door was open, and the room was empty of her presence, and he stood in the doorway of the front bedroom. And she looked up from the book she was reading and said, "Thomas gets home tomorrow at noon." And he said, "I know." And she went back to her book. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and then he went downstairs and made dinner. And he was careful not to make too much of it, because she was careful not to make too much of it. And that was how they had learned to move through things. By not weighing them past what they could hold. The wedding ring stayed in the coastal house. Elena had kept it. He hadn't known she had it until the first year, when he found it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, sitting in the winter light. He had looked at it for a moment and not touched it. She never said anything about it, and he never asked. In the 5th year, when Thomas was just past 4 and the foundation was fully operational, and the porch railing had needed repainting again, Elena put the ring in a small glass case on the mantel in the front room. No explanation, no ceremony. She simply put it there one afternoon, and it was there from then on. Thomas, when he was old enough to ask, pointed at it once and said, "What is that?" Elena looked at Damian. He looked back at her. The look lasted a moment, and inside it was everything. The hotel room, and the letter, and the train, and the coastal estate, and the headlights, and a federal recorder on a gravel drive, and a hospital corridor in February, and a front yard in January, and 3 years of letters, and a porch railing in a back bedroom, and an evening on the porch, and the particular weight of a small hand reaching up without looking to confirm that someone is still there. "It is ours," Elena said. She looked at Thomas steadily. "It means we made some very big mistakes, and then we made some very hard choices, and the choices were worth it." Thomas looked at the case for a moment with the focused consideration of a 4-year-old cataloging new information. Then he said, "Can I have a snack?" Which was the appropriate response, and Elena said yes. And he ran to the kitchen, and the ring stayed in its case on the mantel in the afternoon light. Damian stood in the front room for a moment after they had both gone to the kitchen. He looked at the ring in the glass. 5 grams of gold, worn thin on the inner edge, carrying 20 years in its surface. The morning it had rested on a hotel sheet beside a letter had been the worst morning of his life, and the beginning of the only life he had actually wanted. He had not earned it cleanly. He did not expect to. What he had done was stay present for every consequence, account for every cost, and show up on a January morning, and let himself be pulled by the hand through a front door into a house that smelled of coffee and blocks and the ordinary complexity of people trying to do better than they had done before. He had built nothing that lasted from the years before. What was in this house? The boy's laughter from the kitchen, the sound of Elena's voice answering him, the ring on the mantel, the repainted railing, the specific quality of the late afternoon light on the coast in January. None of it was built the way he used to build things. None of it required leverage or force or the careful application of fear. It required only the daily decision to be present, which was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do, and the only thing that had ever produced something he was not afraid to lose. He went to the kitchen. Thomas was on the counter, which he was not supposed to be on, reaching for the cabinet where Elena kept the crackers, conducting negotiations that were not going particularly well. Elena was at the counter beside him, with her arms crossed in the expression of a woman who has had this specific conversation 11 times this week and is prepared to have an 11th. Damian lifted Thomas off the counter, handed him the crackers, set him on the floor. Thomas ran. Elena looked at Damian. That is not helping. No, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. Then something moved in her face. Not a smile exactly, but the expression that existed in the same neighborhood. The one that appeared sometimes in the evening when Thomas had said something that required recording. The one he had been watching slowly return across 3 years of ordinary afternoons. She picked up her coffee. She went to the window. The January light was going fast outside, the way it did up here near the water. The short days collapsing into long evenings that were cold and clear and full of the sound of the sea. "Dinner," she said. "You cook." "I know," he said, and he did.